You're watching a Hanford Communities issue briefing, highlighting important environmental cleanup issues at the U.S. Department of Energy's Hanford site in southeastern Washington, issues affecting citizens of the Pacific Northwest and the nation. The Hanford Communities organization was established in 1994 and is comprised of the communities surrounding the Hanford site, forming one voice to advise the Department of Energy on important transition and cleanup issues.
Hi, and welcome to another Hanford Communities issue briefing. I'm Rob Roxburgh. In past issue briefings, we've covered some of the highest priority cleanup projects now underway at Hanford, including updates on tank waste and groundwater remediation. Today we're going to focus on some of the regulations that help ensure these cleanup efforts and other work at Hanford are protective of the environment and human health today and far into the future. The Washington Department of Ecology is the state regulator for the site. This agency is preparing to reissue its Hanford permit this spring. This permit is the state's primary tool for ensuring Hanford cleanup is both safe and effective. Ecology's Madeline Brown joins us today to explain why this permit matters, what it does, and how you can help. Welcome.
What I'm going to explain is the role of Washington in Hanford's cleanup, and particularly how the permit we issue for Hanford fits into Hanford's cleanup. The name of the permit is the Hanford Facility Dangerous Waste Permit. Long words because we like to give things long names, but we're all human, so we call it something shorter, and we call it the site-wide permit. Ecology's role at Hanford is to make sure that Hanford's cleanup protects the environment by following state rules for protecting our air, land, and water. Hanford was a plutonium factory for 40 years, and making plutonium was a very inefficient process. To make a little bit of plutonium, you make a lot of waste. Hanford made a lot of plutonium and a very lot of waste. Now, if you've ever made a mess, you know it takes longer to clean the mess up than it did to make the mess in the first place. Hanford made a mess for 40 years. The cleanup will take a very long time. First the mess, then the laws. And I want to go over these laws a little bit because they all have a role at Hanford. The first law was the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. It actually came along a little sooner, but it was amended a few times. The important thing about the Atomic Energy Act is that it reserves to the federal government the authority to manage itself or to regulate itself for nuclear wastes. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, another long name, so we shorten it, we call it RCRA. RCRA came along in 1976, and it's for the management of hazardous wastes, not radioactive ones. Hazardous wastes that are chemically hazardous, like lead, zinc, arsenic, PCBs, things like that, from cradle to grave. The United States Environmental Protection Agency delegates the authority to implement this law to the various states, including Washington's. So Washington has the authority to regulate under RCRA through our state laws. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, we say CERCLA or sometimes Superfund. This law deals with hazardous waste. It also deals with radioactive wastes, and this law is not delegatable to the states. So the Environmental Protection Agency implements this law, which we call CERCLA or Superfund. And it differs from RCRA in another way in that it deals with abandoned sites, beyond cradle to grave, to after the grave marker's gone, if you would. The final law I want to mention is the Federal Facilities Compliance Act, which is the final nail in the Hanford cleanup coffin. This law said, once and for all, yes, federal government, yes, Department of Energy, yes, Department of Defense, you must follow state laws and federal laws for environmental cleanup. You do not have sovereign immunity. You must follow the law like everyone else. I mentioned that the state has authority to implement RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, for hazardous materials. We do this through the state law, the Hazardous Waste Management Act, and that when the rubber hits the road, that's through the dangerous waste regulations in the Washington Administrative Code. Washington does have other permits besides Hanford's. Hanford's is clearly the largest. This map shows dangerous waste permits, but many other activities have permits. We have building permits, discharge permits, wetland permits, pesticide application permits, burning permits. All the permits, their purpose is to keep people in the environment safe. Hanford has 70 square miles of groundwater contaminated above drinking water standards. Sitting in underground storage tanks is 56 million gallons of highly radioactive and chemically dangerous waste awaiting treatment in the VIT plant. Hanford has hundreds of contaminated buildings. Hanford has hundreds of contaminated soil sites and millions of tons of contaminated soil. So the way we knit it all together is through the Tri-Party Agreement. That's the short name for the Hanford Federal Facility Agreement and Consent Order. It's a legal agreement between the Department of Energy, the state of Washington, which regulates under RCRA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates under CERCLA. Each of these agencies has authority from those laws, and they do overlap somewhat. And so the way it all comes together is spelled out in this agreement. The agreement has two parts. One part is the rules on how DOE, EPA, and ecology work together, how they resolve their differences, how they make revisions to the agreement when that's needed, how they sort things out, which regulating agency will be the lead on a particular part of the cleanup, and so forth. The other part of the agreement are the schedules. Now, Hanford's working, making plutonium, and then, oh, there's a big mess. How, you cannot, just when you do not flip a switch and say, today we're in a regulated environment, we are now in compliance. No. When on Monday, the waste is going into unlined, being discharged into unlined trenches, on Tuesday, that trench has to have a liner and be monitored. It doesn't happen that way. They have to build the lined, monitored trench. So the schedules are for doing the work to get Hanford into compliance. And the arrangement is, yes, you're out of compliance, but since you're working to get into compliance, we, the regulating agencies, will not zap you because we know you're working to get into compliance. Now, the agreement, the Tri-Party Agreement is linked to the permit a couple of ways. It's an attachment to the permit, and the schedules in the Tri-Party Agreement are enforceable through the permit. Also, the Tri-Party Agreement, back in the rules part, says ecology will do its part of regulating Hanford through a dangerous waste permit. Now, the regulations do not allow us to permit anything less than a complete facility. Hanford is a very large facility. 586 square miles, yet not every part of it is doing the exact same thing. Many miles are natural and have nothing on them, but could someday. The rules for designing and building and operating the waste treatment plant are vastly different than how you handle an old discharge pond that is most of the contaminated soil has been dug up and plugged out, and now you have a little groundwater contamination to chase after. These are different, yet they're very interlinked. So we have a very large permit for the entire facility, but it has separate parts to deal with the various different facilities at Hanford. The permit covers the treatment, storage, and disposal of dangerous wastes. What the state calls dangerous wastes are what you and I call chemically hazardous wastes, and also some extremely hazardous waste and other things. The term dangerous is a little more inclusive than just chemically hazardous waste. The permit does not regulate radioactive materials unless they're chemically linked with the chemically hazardous stuff. When you have an atom of radioactive material that is in the same molecule as a chemically hazardous one, you can't divide them. So we regulate the chemically hazardous part, and the radioactive stuff sort of comes along with it. We call these mixed wastes, and the overwhelming majority of wastes at Hanford are in fact mixed wastes. The permit does not cover solely radioactive materials because the Energy Department has authority for that under the Atomic Energy Act. Well, how exactly does the permit protect the environment and people? It sets out rules in statements we call conditions. A condition says, you will do this or you will do that. And these rules cover common sense things that are needed for safely managing dangerous and chemically hazardous wastes from cradle to grave. Things like inspections, like how often it'll be inspected, things like rules for keeping incompatible wastes from mixing, prompt spill response, notification, and cleanup. These may seem like common sense things today, yet we know that when there are accidents and when there are disasters, it's because these very common sense things have not been done. If the emergency response equipment is locked up and the guy with the key isn't there, that does not help. If the workers don't know what they're working with, bad things can happen. If the spill is not dealt with right away, bad things can happen. Other ways the permit protects are having criteria for knowing what kind of waste a part of Hanford is going to accept, having plans for managing emergencies, requirements for cleaning up contamination, making sure the disposal trenches are lined and monitored. The permit also has teeth. It does permit financial and criminal penalties, and Hanford has received some financial penalties. The permit is a living document. It is reissued every 10 years, and during the reissuing process, the old permit continues to be in effect. The permit's modified very frequently because situations change. It can change to add units, to add additional parts of Hanford, and it can change to remove units that are cleaned up. An example of why a unit would be removed is if it is clean closed. That means there is nothing left that's chemically hazardous. Then there's nothing left to regulate. So when the Energy Department is able to clean close something, it can leave the permit. Example of units being added to the permit today are the Central Waste Complex and some of the old disposal ponds and ditches. They have not had final conditions in the permit yet. When we reissue the permit, we will have final conditions for almost every unit in the permit. And if we don't have the final conditions, we will have enforceable schedules for getting what we need to put in place the final conditions. Another example of a unit to be added to the permit is that we know we will need a new facility to store the vitrified glass that comes out of the vitrification plant, since we know it's not going to be going to Yucca Mountain. So thousands of canisters of glass will need a storage facility. That's an example of a new unit to be added to the permit in the future. The reissued permit is about 14,000 pages. Now, this picture does not show the new permit. This is showing the vitrification plant's permit, which is most of the permit. More than half of the pages in the site-wide permit are for the vitrification plant. It's a very complex facility. We realized we are the Department of Ecology, and our job is to protect and preserve and restore the environment. And we looked a little harder at our requirements for printing out draft copies. And we whittled the number that we would put out from 25 to 3. We will maintain this practice not just for this draft permit, but for the final permit and for the modifications to the permit and for the other permits ecology issues. We think we'll save a lot of trees and money this way. I want to describe how these 14,000 pages are organized. They're in parts. Part 1 have the general and standard conditions. These are conditions or rules that apply to every dangerous waste permit in the state. It includes things like, you will let us on the site to inspect. You will have a permit. When things change, you will submit modifications. Pretty basic things. Part 2 has conditions that apply across Hanford. This includes things like a site-wide emergency response plan, a site-wide training plan, also conditions for the underground pipes. Under Hanford, there's a lot of plumbing, not belonging to a particular unit, but between the units. And so in the Part 2 are the rules for mapping these pipes and for managing these pipes, as an example. In Part 3, we have the units, those are parts of Hanford, that actively treat, store, and dispose of waste. These operating units, let me give you examples. The vitrification plant is a very, very large treatment plant. If you drive from Richland to Vantage, you may notice some buildings off to the right, not big concrete ones, but little buildings. All those little buildings are the Central Waste Complex. This is a storage facility. And so at the Central Waste Complex, that's an example of an active operating storage facility. An operating disposal site is a site that's still receiving waste. And an example of that is the trench at Hanford that holds the defueled submarine reactor compartments from the United States Navy. And those reactor compartments, if you've seen one come to Hanford, you know it. They're enormous, and they're trucked, they're barged through Puget Sound, the Straits of Juan de Fuca, down in the Pacific Ocean, and then up the Columbia River to north of Richland, and then they are trucked for their final last piece of their journey before they repose at Hanford forever, because that's disposal. So that's an example of a disposal facility. In Part 4, it's like a placeholder. Part 4 has units that are being cleaned up under CERCLA. They're also in the permit, but we agree to have the work take place under CERCLA, and we're reserving the right to require more cleanup if we do not think that's sufficiently protective. Part 5 has units that are no longer active. They're going to be closed. And in very lay terms, what closure means is you either clean up everything, remove everything that's bad, so there's nothing bad left, and that's clean closure. Or you remove what you can, and then you leave it in a safe configuration for the future with monitoring to make sure that it remains safe. We call that landfill closure. So the units in Part 5 will either be clean closed and leave the permit, or they will become landfill closures, and then they will move into Part 6, which is for post-closure units. And those are units where much of what's hazardous has been removed, but not everything, and so there's continued monitoring. An example of a closing unit would be the cribs, ponds, and trenches that discharge contaminated liquid to. Another example would be the single shell tanks. By regulation, single shell tanks are not allowed. RCRA requires 2 liners, and so single shell tanks are by definition non-compliant, yet we do not have a practical alternative to them just yet, and so we are continuing to store waste in a closing unit. To accommodate the fact that we will have to continue storing waste in non-compliant single shell tanks, this closing unit of the permit has operating conditions for retrieval, monitoring, transferring waste, and so forth. To help you understand the units in the permit a little more clearly, we've created unit cards that describe each unit. And these are all available on our website that I really hope you will visit. And the cards have several features. They have a picture of the unit. They have a gee-whiz fact about the unit. They also show where the unit is on Hanford. They have the unit's official name and its official permit unit number, which is useful if you want to find that part of the permit. And they have some stats, sort of like you'd find on a baseball card, stats about the facility and stats about how much waste it handles. There's a little bit of text that describes where the waste comes from and where the waste goes to. And there's a statement about risk, about how hazardous the facility is, where the waste in the facility is. And they're also color-coded. For example, the operating units have a burnt orange border. Reissuing the permit is not the same as a modification. When we reissue the permit, every single one of those 14,000 pages can be reviewed and commented on. We have a very long comment period. It starts May 1, it ends September 30th. We do plan a public workshop on May 3rd in the Ecology office. It's a day-long affair, and if you'd like to participate in person or if you'd like to participate online, please contact Hanford at ecY.wa.gov, and we will tell you how to get to our office or to participate online. This is not going to be a quick overview like this one right now, but it'll be an all-day affair to help people really get their arms around what's in the permit and what matters. We do plan to have short workshops and with our public hearings. We have 4 public hearings scheduled. First in Seattle, May 15th, Portland, May 16th, Spokane, June 5th, and Richland on June 6th. And the June 6th Richland hearing will be at the library. You can learn more about the permit today. We have the parts of the draft permit posted, and as more parts become ready, we will continue to post more of it. On our website, we have a frequently asked questions document. We have the unit cards that explain what parts of Hanford the permit's regulating and how they relate to each other. We have the permit's fact sheet, which is a document that describes the decision-making process, the regulatory history, facts about the overall permit, facts about each unit, and also the basis for the conditions, or if we have reasons to vary or provide alternatives to the regs. We also have some of the units and their attachments. It also gives you a link to the other permits we issue besides the big Hanford permit. Another way to learn more is to have a presentation like this one. If you have a class or a group you'd like a permit presentation to, we'd be more than happy to come and talk to you. Just contact Hanford at ecy.wa.gov. What I hope I've conveyed is the role of the state's Department of Ecology in Hanford's cleanup, and how the permit is our tool for protecting health and the environment from Hanford's hazards, and how you can participate and make sure this permit is as strong as it needs to be.
We'd like to thank Ecology for being here today to explain the purpose and history of this complex document. As we learned, this permit is in place to protect current residents, future generations, and the environment from contamination at Hanford. But a permit as large and complex as Hanford's needs your input to make it the best it can be. The permit is now available for review on Ecology's website. And again, a public comment period is open from May 1st through September 30th. During this time, you are welcome to go to the website, review the permit, and feel free to comment on any portion. Ecology welcomes your comments and your feedback. This has been another Hanford Communities Issue Briefing. Thanks for watching.
To find out how you can become more involved in this important regional issue, or to have a Hanford Communities speaker talk to your organization, contact the Hanford Communities at 509-942-7348 or by fax at 509-942-7379, or visit our website at www.ci.richland.wa.us.